everyone, and today we are starting a series of workshops delivered by young foreign researchers in English. I would like to introduce our very distinguished guest, Dr. Shakir Aziz, linguist and translator for English, Urdu and Punjabi. He is going to reveal the results of his corpus-based study of online registers of Pakistani English, a variant of English belonging to the outer circle according to Braj Kachru. Dr. Aziz analyzes various genres of the internet communication, news, new media, individual and interactive registers, blog comments, Facebook groups, Facebook status updates, and tweets. The study utilizes MD analysis, a comparative and quantitative approach to study register variation, to compare the online registers of Pakistani English with similar offline registers, such as face-to-face communication, talk shows, interviews, columns and news reports, and similar registers of American English. And I'm happy to give the floor to Mr. Shakir Aziz. Okay?
That's the reason. Yeah, it happens in Zoom. Please, thanks a lot for this these kind words for the introduction, and please forgive the background. That's just the street, so you will keep hearing these things coming and going and people talking. But let me start. I will try to finish it in about 30 to 35 minutes, and then if you have any questions, you can ask. This was my PhD topic from University of Münster. As you have already introduced it, so I will move on to the next. The outline, I will talk about a little bit about introduction, background, the variety, the theoretical framework, and the methodological framework. Then I will talk about research questions, the data that I have analyzed, and then I'm going to talk about three multidimensional dimensionality reduction techniques. Multidimensional analysis, which is done using exploratory factor analysis. Then there is a cluster analysis for the second one, text types, and then this canonical discriminant analysis. And then I will conclude it and try to connect these results with the theory of world Englishes and digital Englishes. What kind of digital? What is digital Englishes? What are they? What is their nature? Okay, so Pakistani English is a post-colonial variety. Traditionally, it is used. It has been used in education, public administration, courts, newspaper, and international communication, and obviously it has expanded in, for example, in the form of electronic media. But I am more or less today I am concerned with the internet and social media, how it has been used for last 2 decades on the internet. And there are various situations where it is used. By situations, I mean communities of practice or places in the internet where it is used. For example, there are different types of blogs. Individual blogs are, for example, on WordPress or blogspot.com. There are news blogs. In the case of Pakistan, they are published on newspaper websites. There are separate categories for them. Then there are technology blogs. These are blog websites, but they particularly publish on technology related topics. And then new media blogs, like they publish viral stories. And then other types of registers are interactive registers. For example, interactive means there are more than one people involved. So Facebook groups, status updates, and tweets, and blog comments that were separated from the blog posts. The theoretical framework is world Englishes because it is the subdiscipline in English linguistics that studies the spread and variation of English. Initial theories or theoretical works, for example, this one, Kachru, 1985, they were grounded in post-colonial history and geography of the varieties of English or English. For example, Pakistani English is called an outer circle variety or a second language variety in initial works. More recently, now people say that, okay, let's try to see English in terms of communities of practice, in terms of the users and usage. as they say, or communicative situations, or more recently, for example, Meyer says that language scapes roughly equal to a community of practice. And these concepts are relevant for the internet because there are no boundaries, no geography. You cannot really say, okay, this country starts here, this country ends. It's in cyberspace, there are no boundaries. So it is easier to look at new English is in terms of communities of practice or communicative situations. So if you want to look at the English communication in terms of communicative situations, then it is easier to apply a methodology like multidimensional analysis, which tries to study situational variation or register variation. And it can be applied for internet registers. Then it is a three-step approach. The first step, there is situational analysis, and the second step is linguistic description, and the last step is functional interpretation. I will not focus on situational analysis today. I will just talk about the linguistic analysis, linguistic descriptions of the data that I analyzed for my PhD. What happens in multidimensional analysis actually is that there are lexicogrammatical features, and it is supposed that each lexicogrammatical feature has a communicative purpose behind it. So I will give you an example of, for example, telling a story or narration. If you want to tell a story, that means the most typical lexicogrammatical features that has been found in previous MD studies would be third person pronouns, he, she, it, they, past tense verbs in English, and then human nouns, for example, agent or nouns like that. So these lexicogrammatical features co-occur to form, they have higher frequencies in narrative texts. So lexicogrammatical features would also, that means lexicogrammatical features which have a similar communicative function, they will co-occur, and this co-occurrence is then found out using dimensionality reduction techniques. What happens is that normalized frequencies are taken, and then dimensionality reduction techniques, so-called dimensionality reduction techniques, are applied. For example, exploratory factor analysis is applied to get sets of features, reduced sets of features, linear combinations of lexicogrammatical features, and then these groups of features are labeled or interpreted in terms of the underlying communicative or discourse function. So a couple of concepts. Register, I have already explained. You already know that register is a situational variety. In terms of multidimensional analysis, text type has a particular meaning. A text type is a group of texts that is similar to each other based on its linguistic characteristics. And by linguistic characteristics means here that based on the dimension scores that were assigned to each text using, for example, exploratory factor analysis. There are other techniques, for example, principal component analysis, but normally this technique is used. For my study, I distinguish two types of registers, as you have already mentioned, as the host. She has already, Dr. Kobanova, sorry for mispronouncing your name. She has already mentioned that I studied these types of registers. I compare them with another type of register, for example, columns, news reports, and conversations. I said they are offline registers because, for example, for blogs, genre-related studies have found that blogs have a historical relationship with columns. They are similar to columns somehow, and news reports. Registers which involve a dialogue, more than two people, for example, Facebook groups have a similarity with spoken dialogue-related registers that I call simply conversations. For example, they can include face-to-face conversations, they can include TV talk shows, or they can include interviews that are broadcasted. So I selected these 5 registers. 3 registers, main conversations are subdivided in 3 more registers to compare them with the 6 or 7 registers that I collected from the internet online. And the research question that I wanted to explore today, to talk about today, is just that what are the differences between Pakistani English and then US English, because multidimensional analysis is a comparative technique. So it would make it easier to see differences. It would highlight how Pakistani English is used, what are the communicative functions related to Pakistani registers and how they are different. So I would try to explore that using three-dimensional reduction techniques that I have already mentioned. And this was the data that was collected for this study. You can see 4 types of blocks here, and then columns. These are number of texts, and these are number of words. More or less, I try to make them 100 words. It wasn't possible always per category. So, for example, individual blocks were not many, so they could not be 100. Others were more than that. I had to make them like 200, so they were more or less 200 texts. So it was a kind of unequal group combinations. The other types of registers were, for example, the interactive online registers. Here you can see comments, Facebook group status updates, and tweets, and then they were compared with conversations. And then conversations were subdivided in 3 groups: 45 talk shows, 45 face-to-face, and 10 interviews. This was the data, and then the first dimensionality reduction technique that was applied in multidimensional analysis. This graph is normally used to see, okay, how many groups of features I should extract, how many dimensions or factors should be retained. On the x-axis, there are a number of factors. On the y-axis, it shows that how much variation is explained by each. So for the first one, you can see the distance between 2 points shows that how much variation is explained by each group. You can see the first one is very large, the second one is a little smaller, the third one is even smaller, the fourth one is, and then it goes, it simply flattens out. There is not much variation explained by the next point. So I decided, okay, let's get first 5 factors, and then they were interpreted in terms of their functional or discourse functions, communicative purposes or discourse functions. These are some descriptive statistics, but I think I will just skip it. They tell how good the analysis was, or how it was done. It's more like technical detail. So let's skip it. If someone wants more details, I can explain it later. So the first dimension, as you have seen here as well, the first one is very large. These are the linguistic features. On the left hand side, you can see what was the what did I call it? I call it oral. This group of features, lexicogrammatical features. In the bold, each on the right hand side, you can see there are adjectives, there are adverbs, there are finite clauses, there are infinite clauses, there are conjunctions, there are reduced forms like that, deletion, and contractions. And then underlined are the actual lexicogrammatical features, and sometimes in the square brackets, I have given examples. In the small brackets, 0.3034, for example, this one, or 0.30, this one, these are the relationship of individual lexicogrammatical feature with the whole factor. So the higher this value is, that means that this feature contributes to the overall communicative function. So they are mostly clause-related features or verb-related, adverb-related features. Let's see more. Pronominal features, different types of verbs here, auxiliary verbs, main verbs are here, more verbs, tense, discourse particles. These are those features that are related to informal discourse. Still more pronouns. Sorry, so the same slide has been repeated. Wow, that happened with me first time. Well, so the slide, just let's move to the next slide then. So the first 2 slides, this one and this one, they are mostly verbal pronominal features, clausal features that are the hallmark of informal registers, spoken registers, interactive registers. So I gave it the name of oral, and the negative side are mostly nominal features, different types of nouns, passive voice, information, packing. There are, for example, prepositions are or post-nominal passive modifiers, prepositions, word length, long verbs, for example, they are there. So they were given the name of literate. So the first dimension is called oral versus literate discourse. Normally, that's the very first dimension whenever a multidimensional study is performed. More or less a distinction between spoken or written registers, or oral versus literate, informational versus informal registers. Okay, I have explained what are the lexicogrammatical features, and then what I did was to calculate dimension scores to describe the individual texts that were in the data. And how these dimension scores were calculated. Here you can see a note that the static, the features marked with an asterisk, they were not included in dimension score calculation. This is how dimension scores were calculated. First of all, normalized frequencies were calculated, and then they were transformed into Z scores. Then these Z scores were summed up together for the positive side as well as for the negative side. And then if they were, for example, in the first dimension, they were dimension score, there were features on the negative side. The sum of negative features was subtracted from the sum of positive features, and it was performed for each text and each register category, and then mean dimension scores were calculated. And these mean dimension scores are shown here. You can see there are two panels. On the left hand side is Pakistani English, on the right hand side is US English, and on from top to bottom you can see registers in descending order of their dimension scores. For example, conversations have the highest score in both varieties, and there are Facebook groups, tweets. There are in between somewhere there are blogs between oral and literate, more literate and less oral, and then at the end highly literate registers, columns and news reports. And in general, if you see in terms of regional variation, Pakistani registers have scores that are less oral. For example, here conversations, US conversations have a higher score as compared to Pakistani. And then on the literate side, Pakistani registers have higher score on the literate side, highly negative score. You can see, for example, columns is 15.7, and then they, for US English just 10, minus 10. And the last thing that I want to point out here is the variance explained by this categorical variable registers and regional varieties. On the x-axis, if you see, put it in a linear model. On the y-axis, the dimension scores, how much of the variation is explained by the text groupings. About 54% of it was explained. That means it's a kind of a strong dimension of variation in the data. The second dimension, I named it conversational style, mainly because it was, there were a lot of adverbs, different types of adverbs. Then there were these hedging related lexical items, something like almost at about conjunctions, clause level conjunctions, so connecting clauses or sentences, adverbial conjunctions as well. And then there were pronouns that are context dependent, demonstrative pronoun, this, that, these data that are context dependent. On the negative side, there were some nominal features. This was the first reason, and the second reason was that the register that has the highest score on this dimension is US conversations. It has the highest score. Other registers also have some, but this is the only register that has the highest score, marked the highest score. That's why I named it conversational style. And here you can see as well then US registers have some high scores on this dimension. Comments, new media blogs, Facebook groups, Pakistani registers either have very low scores or negative scores. Or on the negative side, there are a lot nominal registers. For example, tweets, news, especially tweets, because there are a lot of at mentions or hashtags. That's why they are highly nominal. And its R squared is about 50% as well. So kind of strong dimension again. The third dimension, I always say that it was related to regional variation. You can see there were some adjectives and then different types of nouns. And these are particular types of nouns that are related to abstract things. For example, cognitive processes, for example, abstract nouns, education, effect, function, process nouns, process or meeting, and translated nouns, evidence, importance, problem. And then there were prepositional phrases that are related to these stance nouns. So I named it abstract evaluation, this group of features. And on the negative side, mainly there were nouns, obviously adverbs and reduced forms, but there were nouns that were non-abstract, concrete nouns like phone, drug, or picture, and activity verbs, for example, make, go, get. So abstract versus non-abstract information, dimension 3. And then the same process, the registers, how they perform on this dimension. You can see on the positive side that literal registers that were on dimension 1 or News blogs, Pakistani news, they have high dimension scores on this dimension. And on the lower side, there are interactive registers, mainly from US English. Pakistani registers have low dimension scores or near zero dimension scores. That means there is some kind of abstract evaluation that is going on there. These non-abstract, abstract related nouns are in higher frequency in Pakistani text as compared to US text in similar registers. Fourth dimension had about 4 or 5 textual features, lexicogrammatical features. They were mainly clauses, that clause controlled by verbs, by communication verbs, by general verbs, and communication verbs themselves like call, talk, ask, or said, and past tense. You can see this dimension here that it is not very strong, just 17% of the R squared variance explained, but the unsurprisingly, news reports have the highest scores because they normally report what somebody said, he said, or they said, for example. And the fifth dimension, last dimension, mainly consisted of this is that classic second classic dimension that is found in almost every multidimensional study. There are third-person pronouns. There are then there are past tense verbs, and then there are human nouns, for example, nouns that are related to family, guy, individual, kid. So that is related to narration, telling stories. I named it narrative focus. The opposite side is mostly present, verb be, or future related, like models of prediction, so future. Narrative focus is also not really a strong dimension, but news reports and new media blogs, they have high dimension scores. So telling stories or narration is more or less hallmark of these types of registers. So these were the 5 dimensions that I got from factor analysis, and I explained how the registers are distributed on each dimension. Let's see. So main aim of the study was to see how Pakistani registers are different. When the similar registers were compared in both varieties, these are p values and in the brackets, and these are z scores of after a post hoc test. These highlighted boxes show that particular register, for example, technology blogs, are significantly different between 2 register varieties. For example, news blogs, you see here that reporting style, they are highly significantly different on reporting style. Pakistani news blogs were on the opposite side. They did not have reporting style. They were not like news reports. Or technology blogs in Pakistani English, they are different on first 2 dimensions. They were online production instead of online production. This was conversational style. Technology blogs were highly literal, and they were also nominal on negative sides of first 2 dimensions. US blogs, technology blogs were not like that. That's why this significant difference. The second group of registers is interactive registers. You can see here that Facebook groups were different on second and third dimension. On the third dimension, they were abstract evaluative. On the first dimension, they were highly nominal, and on the last dimension, they were non-narrative. Mostly Pakistani Facebook groups talked about, for example, the texts were related to asking for help, for example. So that's not a past related concern, that is a future related or present related concern. That's why they were non-narrative. There were advertisements, for example. People were talking about study, or people were talking about their pets. So these made it highly nominal instead of conversational or non-abstract. Facebook status update has similar qualities as well, and Pakistani tweets as well. They were highly non-abstract, abstract evaluative as compared to US tweets. Apart from regional differences, through hierarchical cluster analysis, I tried to see how similar online and offline registers are different. Here you see 2 panels, Pakistani, this PK, and then US. I used mean dimension scores, and then I applied hierarchical cluster analysis on it. And you can see these three kind of structures. There are columns, technology blogs, news blogs. Both of them in both regional varieties. Okay, they are complicated, but just wanted to point out one thing: how columns and technology blogs are similar in Pakistani data, and how it's opposite in US data. Columns and news blogs are similar. On the contrary, technology blogs are in US English are more or less like individual blogs. So the reason was that Pakistani blogs were highly literal and nominal and informational, as compared to US technology blogs, which were like conversational. They were written like in an informal way. Pakistani technology blogs were not written like that. And the second thing I wanted to point out was that Pakistani news blogs were not like columns as it is here for US English. Pakistani columns were highly informational and literate. They are written by professional writers. Pakistani news blogs are not written like that. They are written by amateur writers, by students who want to publish their content, their essays, one could say, on newspaper websites. US technology news blogs are a different thing. I cannot really say who writes them, but there is a lot of similarity, linguistic similarity between US columns and news blogs. So these are kind of idiosyncratic register-related differences in both regional varieties. Similar things was done for interactive register. Here you can see that there are not just one register into conversation. I have divided it into 3 talk shows, and then you can see interviews and face-to-face. Again, it is too complicated. Just wanted to point out one thing, that see face-to-face conversations here, how different they are. They become part of the rest of the tree at the end. And on the x-axis, you can see that how large the difference is, how large the distance is. In terms of Pakistani face-to-face conversations, they are more or less similar to in the same cluster as comments and Facebook groups and talk shows. So what I inferred from this finding was that Pakistani face-to-face conversations are very similar with like our other registers. US face-to-face conversations are not like that. They are, for example, narrative. Pakistani face-to-face conversations are not. They are very abstract evaluative. Pakistani and US face-to-face conversations are not. So the main thing was that that was part of my situational analysis. The topics discussed were related to society, non-personal, or study, for example, or religion. Similar topics were discussed in, for example, comments or Facebook groups. That meant that similar lexicogrammatical features were used, and that resulted in this similarity. That was not the case with US blogs. So Pakistanis use English, whether it is offline or online, in similar ways for similar communicative purposes. To summarize this large part of the presentation in an interim summary, I have mentioned that there were first 3 dimensions were had a kind of higher dimension R squared or variance explained, so they were kind of strong, moderately strong. The last 2 were less relevant. Pakistani registers were, as I pointed out, they were less oral, they were mostly literate, less conversational, and they had abstract evaluative informational discourse as compared to the opposite in US registers. Pakistani blogs were generally oral and informal as compared to their similar registers, columns, and news reports. And Pakistani interactive registers, for example, as I have mentioned here as well, have a limited functional range and linguistic diversity because of the similar communicative purposes they are used for. Then there are individual in terms of registers that differ in both varieties. Technology blogs, Facebook groups, and status updates I have mentioned previously. They are generally literate and they are non-narrative. And especially in terms of Facebook groups, the main differences are due to the communicative function of asking for help, asking for information, and topics like study, business, e-commerce. that are not present in US English. And for status updates as well, they are not used for personal, for example, talking about personal feelings. They are used for talk about business or give advertisements or ask, okay, I am looking for a freelancer to do something like that. People post their status updates in English for that purpose. They do not say, okay, I am feeling sick or I am tired of this world or something like that. That happens in US English. That doesn't happen in Pakistani English on the internet. The second dimensionality reduction technique that I used was, it's called cluster analysis. It is an unsupervised technique because you don't have to give group labels, but you do have to give number of clusters. They were obtained using different statistical techniques that I'm not going to discuss here. This was the method that was used partitioning around medioids. Basically what it does is it will select 4 most optimal texts as centers, and then it will try to build clusters of text around it that are most similar to them. What were the results? I am more interested to talk about the results here. First thing, here you can see the plotting of 4 clusters on each dimension. Each text is given a number according to its cluster membership, and then they are plotted. For example, here dimension 1 on one side, and then dimension 2 on the other side. And here it is dimension 2, dimension 1 and dimension 3, and then here's dimension 1 and dimension 4. Here you can see that the most distinctive grouping is dimension 1 again against all other dimensions. Other than that, for example, here dimension 2 versus dimension 3 or dimension 2 versus dimension 4, they are like they are amalgamated together, so they are not really groupings based on these dimensions. One could say they are tendencies, but they are not really strong groupings of text. But still, it is useful to see, okay, how these what kind of differences are there in Pakistani English and US English with respect to these textual groupings. So first of all, I said, okay, these are 4 textual groupings. Let's name them according to the central texts and their dimension scores. You can see the central text for cluster number 1, cluster number 2, cluster number 3, cluster number 4, and their dimension score. For example, for the first cluster, you can see here that it has very high score on dimension 1, highly oral, and then on conversational style it has high score. On the third dimension it has score on the negative side, so non-abstract. Last 2 dimensions are more or less irrelevant here, so I named it oral non-abstract. The second one was named unmarked oral because it was oral but not that much, but it was still conversational and non-abstract nonetheless. The third one was named unmarked abstract evaluative because it had first it was the only actually cluster that had high, positive dimension score on dimension 3, and in the first 2 dimensions it had a negative score, and the last one was named literate nominal. It was kind of polar opposite to the first one, high dimension, negative dimension score on first 2 dimensions and the third dimension as well. So they were given, but let's see how these 4 groupings are in both regional varieties. Here you can see above Pakistani English, below US English, and online registers from individual blogs, 4 types of blogs, comments, Facebook groups, status updates, and tweets. The white textual groupings are oral groupings. The dark textual groupings are literate groupings. And you can, for the first thing as you can see is there is a lots of dark in Pakistani registers. For example, you can see here in technology blogs, it's a lot darker as compared to directly below its US counterpart. Other thing is that in terms of interactive registers, there's a lot of white in US English. For example, here you can see, and in terms of Pakistan, it's less white, more gray areas. So unmarked oral types of registers or literate types of registers for Facebook status updates, for example. So Pakistani English registers are again less oral, more literate. Nominal types of discourse again visible through this analysis as well. That could be summarized here that, okay, the first thing is that this analysis is like more like tendencies. They are not real text groupings. And then Pakistani English registers are like we have seen in multidimensional analysis. They are oral, more literate and abstract evaluative as compared to their US counterparts. And okay, some registers, online interactive registers are sometimes oral non-abstract as well. The last dimensionality reduction technique was a canonical discriminant analysis, and this is a supervised dimensionality reduction technique. You have to give group labels to discriminate. Basically, it discriminates, it takes a lot of lexicogrammatical features, and then it tries to see, okay, which groups, which lexicogrammatical features distinguish between the given groups maximally, and then it creates linear groups of features. It provides output similar to factors, the output of exploratory factor analysis that I explained in terms of MD analysis, multidimensional analysis. So it gives you the feature loadings. If it gives you factor scores for individual text that can be used to plot texts. So since it was used just to discriminate between two regional varieties, Pakistani English and US, there were just two groups. So only one discriminant was produced. This is that linear group of features. This is the positive side. You can see here there are coordinating conjunction at clause level. For example, here it is funny and it is ironic. So to connect two clauses, there are contractions, informal registers, indefinite articles. I didn't know what to do for it, but then these are adverbial features related to verbs and emphatics. It's again informal discourse, that deletion, again informal discourse, that clause is controlled by verbs. So again, verbal features, standard prepositions that are used in normally informal text, also in conversations, and relative clauses. That relative clause is kind of informal as compared to which relative clauses, which are on the next slide. So these features are related to mostly oral informal discourse. On the negative side, you can see that these are WH relative clauses mostly related to formal discourse, coordinating conjunction, phrase level. For example, here, instead of clauses, here the clause level coordinating conjunctions, here it is phrase level. So phrasal discourse, agentless passives, high density information and nominalizations, again, high density information. So this kind of discourse would be could set literate formal discourse or language. So this general communicative dimension that distinguishes both regional varieties is in oral informal versus literate formal language. Obviously, Pakistani English would have a high score on the negative side, as you can see here. All of the registers, or 11 of them, these are different types of blogs. And then these are online registers, comments, Facebook groups, interactive registers, Facebook status and tweets, and then the columns, conversations, and news reports. The darker registers are Pakistani English. The lighter box plots are US English, and you can see that US registers in each category, they have a higher score as compared to Pakistani English. So formal or literate type of discourse is the main communicative function that could be associated with Pakistani registers, and informal oral type of discourse could be associated with US registers. So I have said that presented the findings in about 3 different methods of analysis. What is the conclusion? How this could be? What could be said about the variety Pakistani English? What could be said about the nature of digital Englishes? So that what I would try to do that in next 3 to 4 slides. Pakistani online registers, I would say that to summarize, Pakistani online registers mean there are more situations to use English. For example, there are blogs now. People write blogs, or people use Facebook groups or simple web forums to write English. There are more situations to use English, but that does not mean that English has been used for more domains or more communicative purposes. Pakistanis use them in semi-public, professional, non-personal domains. For example, talking about business or education, they do not talk about person or self in English. There are idiosyncratic uses. For, as I mentioned previously, technology blogs in Pakistan are highly informational, that is specific to Pakistan, or news blogs. they are used as a medium by amateur writers to get published on a reputed newspaper website. They cannot publish it in columns, for example. That is limited to people who, for example, have a PhD in a subject. But if you are a student, you can still send your blog post in the blog section, and it will be published. It will be kind of your publication. It will be a kind of pride for you. Then the other thing that came up in the comparison of interactive registers, interactive online registers with similar Facebook face-to-face conversations, and that they are very much similar to each other as compared to US English face-to-face conversations and other online interactive registers. That means Pakistani English is restricted in terms of communicative functions associated to English. Pakistani registers are used to talk about, for example, study help, business related help, that are non-personal topics. And then they are less narrative and future oriented, especially Facebook groups and Facebook status updates, because the things they talk about, they are not talking about, okay, that something happened to me yesterday. They are talking about how can I get something done tomorrow or something, for example. So they are non-narrative and future oriented as compared to US English registers. In terms of nature of what is online English is, what are digital English is, and what okay, so first, what could be possible reasons? The first reason could be, for example, Pakistanis have a multilingual repertoire, so they talk about personality or self or their personal feelings in indigenous languages. They do not talk about that in English because they want to interact with other people. That's why Pakistani Facebook groups, for example, they do not have stories. These stories are told in Urdu. That means that Pakistani online registers are kind of extensions of offline English usage. They are used for similar purposes. For example, traditionally English is used in higher education for international communication or for business. Something similar happens in online registers as well. They are used for similar topics, similar domains, but still that makes it, internet is a global space. That means we are doing something local in a global space. We are connecting to each other through this global space. We don't have nothing to do with, we are not connecting with, okay, we are connecting with international audience as well, but a part of us is connecting with ourselves, with other Pakistanis that are online. So we are performing localized interactions, similar interactions that were performed before internet. And we are doing that in this global space now. So what that means for digital English is that means that digital English is now, when we talk about digital English, is not all digital Englishes are global in nature. They can be local as well. As Pakistani English, example of Pakistani English, Pakistanis are connected to each other through these local networks. Internet, if we see internet as a gigantic network, that doesn't mean that everyone is connected to everyone. It is a network of networks, and there are some networks that are local. They are connected to other networks as well, but the people in those networks are interacting with each other, and they are interacting locally for their local purposes. So these situations are local situations in the global space of internet. So that means that digital Englishes have a dual nature. Then they are globalized and they are localized at the same time. And they could be globalized English. For example, there could be a players community where players from all over the world, they are playing a game and then they are interacting in chat boxes to each other. So that would be a global digital English. But then there are these digital Englishes that are local. There are Pakistanis on Facebook groups who have made Facebook groups, for example, to talk about e-commerce in Pakistan, and it has nothing to do with e-commerce in India or in Bangladesh or in the USA. That means it is local. This particular community of practice is local, even if it is located in the internet. So there could be Englishes that are global as well as local. And if you want to describe digital English, you have to look at them in both ways. Otherwise, it will be difficult to theorize correctly for cyberspace-oriented English varieties. And I think that's the end. These are the references, some of the references that I mentioned previously. And that's the end of my talk. Thanks a lot for listening. And if you have any questions, please.
Dear students, colleagues, I've got a question. What can be said about the status of Pakistani English from the point of view of Kachru, his theory of circles?
As I have said, that there is not much difference between the online registers and offline registers. So I would conclude that it doesn't change anything in terms of Kachru's model. Kachru says Pakistani English is an outer circle variety, and which is used for some purposes in a multilingual repertoire, and that is what my research also says. It is used for some purposes, but other communicative purposes are fulfilled by other local languages. For example, talking about self or talking about my feelings, US English, people talk about in English for everything. They will talk about, okay, I am not feeling good or bad. I normally don't say that. I do that in my mother tongue, that is Urdu or other indigenous languages. So Pakistani English remains the same. It remains an outer circle variety, even if it is being used now on the internet. Even if it looks like it is expanding, yes, it is expanding. It has got more users, it has got more situations, but the communicative purposes that were traditionally associated with English, they remain the same.
If you, for example, speak about Pakistani English on the internet, yes.
Yeah.
If people are writing not blogs, but if they're discussing something, if it is a kind of informal communication, they still use on the internet English, Pakistani English, not their native, languages, local varieties, no? Because you said that Pakistani English generally is restricted to certain spheres, and as I understand, it is more typical of non-informal communications, rather formal business-like communication. Yes, juridical sphere maybe. And online people prefer to use English. Yes.
They actually, well, there is a lot of English is just a part of a whole. It's a very small part of a whole. If you look at English, okay, let's see, if we have 60 plus languages in Pakistan, and a large part of our population, 90% plus, is not able to speak English. Okay, and that means if they are not able to speak, they speak English only if it is absolutely necessary. For example, talking about higher education, Pakistanis use English in groups like e-commerce or study help in Germany or study help in Austria, or what else? Technical help, or they want to advertise for a position of a software developer, they will publish in English. Other than that, it is local languages, and they more or less, they are like 90% plus of the times. And obviously I just selected those texts that were English or mostly English, because I wanted to run this analysis that was based on English features. I didn't select the text that had a large part in Urdu, for example. If I had selected them, probably it would have been more richer, the analysis, but I have selected a very restricted part of the communication that happens between Pakistanis online, and that communication is used for very formal kind of situations, not for informal situations. For informal situations, local languages are used, and that part is unfortunately is not reflected in my analysis because I did not analyze it.
Thank you very much. And what can be said about some typical features of Pakistani English, which are which make Pakistani English different from other varieties of English? Are there any specific features, like for example in Indian, in tag questions, they use only one tag, yes, I do, I like it, isn't it? Maybe there are such things. It will be quite interesting.
Yes, the thing is that the type of analysis that I did there wasn't doesn't focus on what are the linguistic features that are typical to Pakistanis and not other way around. For example, in terms of phonology, I have a typical way of speaking. I do not speak. I just speak. I am not this adding talk. For example, I just say talk. So you can see the difference. This is a typical South Asian feature in terms of phonology. So in terms of lexical grammar, there are features that distinguish Pakistani English from other varieties. But this analysis wasn't focusing on that aspect. It selected those lexicogrammatical features that had a communicative function. For example, past tense verbs and third person pronouns and human nouns. Those features, when they come together, when they co-occur, normally they co-occur in those texts where narrative discourse is present, or where stories are being told that are in past tense. So those types of linguistic features were examined here that had a communicative purpose, that could have a communicative purpose. I didn't select those lexicogrammatical features. For example, there is a lexicogrammatical feature that is typical to Pakistani English, is that we use ditransitive verbs in a different way. Indian English as well. He gave a pen to me. This is one pattern, a pen to me. He gave me a pen. This is another pattern. The second one is called double object. He gave me a pen. And this one, he gave a pen to me. It is called two dative construction. And Pakistanis use he gave a pen to me more often as compared to he gave me a pen. And it has been studied in this was my master's thesis basically. So I did study that, but for this particular study, I didn't take into account, for example, this construction because it doesn't have any communicative value. Why he gave a pen to me, he gave me a pen, you cannot see that. It doesn't tell you anything, okay, what kind of discourse is there. So the communicative function isn't involved with these types of lexicogrammatical features. So I didn't include them. I just included those features that has a communicative function with them. For example, contractions or that deletion, they tell that the discourse is informal. They are normally occur in interactive register, in spoken conversations, for example, they occur there. If the that deletion doesn't, I said that instead of I said I want to do, for example, that deletion doesn't occur, that means that's a formal discourse. So this type of analysis looked at communicative functions. I would like to look at other features as well, but that's a future for someone else, or probably for me in a couple of years. I would do that as well, but for the time being, I looked at communicative functions and those features that had a communicative value, communicative function involved, attached to them, and how they were differently used in Pakistani English, or which features were highly used in Pakistani English. And then I try to see, okay, is it formal or informal? And I concluded, yes, okay, Pakistani English is formal as always. It was always formal. It is formal on the internet as well. It is not different. It is expanded, but it is not different.
Thank you very much. Any other questions, maybe? No questions. Don't be shy. Well, you said, well, may I? You spoke about oral informal, yes, registers versus literate and formal, yes? And what
Yes.
about oral formal communications. You did not take them into consideration.
Oral
if it
formal
is
communication.
oral and formal, or it is
Yeah,
informal and literate.
they could be, but I think in my data they were not. For example, oral for a typical example of oral formal register could be presentation. No? As I am speaking, this is oral as well as formal, because I am trying to be formal, and I am, and again I am oral as well. So presentations are a kind of oral formal register, but that wasn't included in my data. No register was included in my data. That was from this particular oral formal category. Comments, Facebook groups, Facebook status updates, different types of blogs. None of them was oral formal in the typical sense of the word, as for example, spoken presentations, conference presentations, or lectures. They could be considered oral formal register. They were not included.
But I suppose it is interesting, yes?
Yeah, that could be interesting,
When
obviously.
combine these two criteria, yes, and you will have some maybe results which will add to your data, yes?
Yeah, obviously that would add another dimension to. I mean, the main technique, multidimensional analysis, is a contrastive technique. You put many registers together, and then you want to see, okay, which one is different in relation to others. Okay, how much different. And that's what I have done. I try to compare different registers and see, okay, yeah, this one is different from that one, and how much on in which particular aspect. If I could add another data point or two other data points, obviously that would give me new perspectives of seeing the contrast. But these registers were collected as they were available. It was kind of a convenient sampling. They were easily available, so they were collected. Others were not included because either they were not present or they were not easier to collect. And I mean, for a PhD research, you can do just that. Something you have to see your own resources. It was an individual project. I had to do everything myself. So I saw what was available, easily available, accessible. I collected that, and then I ran the analysis.
Thank you very much. Any questions in the... No questions in the chat. I'm checking YouTube right now, here. And also in our Zoom conference, I can't see any questions. So everything seems clear and so thorough.
Okay.
Thank you very much for a very thorough, informative, and very detailed analysis. It's an example of how a linguistic analysis should be done, because very detailed, I should say, criteria. So all the numbers, everything is clear, everything is, well, in a just amazing manner it is done. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for inviting
Yes,
me.
thank
Giving me
you.
the opportunity.
And I suppose we'll meet again.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe you will speak about Pakistani English as some peculiar, typical, characteristic features, yes, which characterize the norm for Pakistani English, but something which is different for other varieties. Russians, for example, tend to omit articles. In Russian English, there is a tendency to omit articles, not to use present perfect tense. So
Yeah, this makes us too. Actually, we do that as well. My professor, when I was writing my PhD thesis, the most typical thing she had to correct for in my academic writing was that I was overusing articles where it was not necessary. I was inserting definite articles there, and the other, I was simply omitting articles. I said, okay, it is fine. There is no the required here, but she said it required, because my mother tongue doesn't have the article. And I suppose I will be working on them in my postdoctorate, hopefully in a couple of months.
thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So I will just unshare my screen, or it has already been done. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You can stay with us and listen to Julia. So, because Julia is our
Okay, yeah.
next speaker,
Hi.
if you don't mind. So, Julia, will you present yourself then? Introduce yourself to our listeners. I've done it twice already. Okay? We are passing over to Julia Yedeleva's presentation on eye tracking in linguistic research. She is trying to do what she did or tried to do yesterday, but now she has more time. Yes?
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. True. So we originally thought I should speak about phonetics, phonology, and the way it is perceived or conceived of by non-native speakers. But yesterday I didn't have enough time to finish what I was planning to finish with regard to eye tracking and linguistic research. And I thought it would be a nice opportunity for me to continue talking about it today, since yesterday was sort of a teaser. With regard to my own person, so yes, as Irina Nikolaevna already told you, I am Julia Edeleva, and I graduated from the University of Nizhny Novgorod, from Linguistics University of Nizhny Novgorod 2011. And since then pursued my career in, or have been pursuing my career in empirical linguistic research. I did my master's at the University of Vienna, which you can see the picture of, by the way, on my slide, in English and American Studies with a focus on language and cognition. And then I did a number of internships, both in the field of clinical and in the field of empirical linguistics, and learned, among others, the eye tracking technique. And since 2015, I have been working on my PhD thesis in language processing and acquisition of relative clauses at the University of Münster under the supervision of Sarah Schimke. And since 2020, I have been employed as a research project member on the acquisition of literacy skills in low-skilled migrants. So far, so good to my background. Now, going back to the topic we started talking about yesterday. So we are going to continue with eye tracking in linguistic research. And yesterday I asked you, or maybe those of you who were there to listen to the teaser. So the first slide was about grammar and our idea of grammar. So what grammar actually is. And I invited you to post your replies or to use the chat to communicate with me and post your replies. So what you think grammar is, here are some of mine. So a grammar can be a grammar book, or the study of linguistic rules and regularities in a particular language. Or it also can be our idea, so an idea of a particular person, a particular individual, or also a particular population, for example, native speakers and non-native speakers, with regard to what these regularities are, what is acceptable or non-acceptable in a particular language, and yes, so and the limits of variability, so the limits of individual differences with regard to linguistic rules. Going back to what Martin Neef told us yesterday, so there is this common distinction between grammar and the lexicon, and whatever your concept of grammar is, so there can be levels such as phonology, morphology, semantics, syntax, or you can treat them as individual modules in Chomskyan sense, and assume that grammar, so there is this grammatical module consistent of which consists of rules, and there are other modules, for example, the phonology module or the semantics module or whatever. In the linguistic theory, or in the theoretical approach that I am most convinced of, there is no distinction between grammar and lexicon, and we speak about, or yes, so the so-called construction grammar speaks about more or less lexically specified constructions. So there are constructions that are more abstract, and there are also lexically specified constructions, and people are concerned with, or scientists are concerned with, putting together the so-called constructicons of a particular language or particular languages under analysis. Yet, so this was kind of a short, yes, a brief intro, so a brief excursus to what Martina told us yesterday. And now with regard to empirical research methods, or why do we actually need them? So if we consider grammar as a grammar book, we can employ such methods as, for example, we can create a book corpus or a corpus of study guides, a corpus of student books which are supposed to teach us the grammar of a particular language and can analyze the can analyze maybe the terms or the definitions these books work with. For the study of linguistic rules and regularities in a particular language, we can employ, we can employ modeling, or we can look at that from the systematic perspective and acknowledge or discover some systematicities and systematic irregularities. But we also need to, the most challenging thing to research is actually the idea that we have in our mind, the idea of grammar, the idea of a language that we have in our mind. Because if we just open up our skull and see what's going on inside, we will not see any grammar, or we will not see any grammatical rules, or we will not see any knowledge. And therefore we should employ appropriate methods to tap into this type of knowledge indirectly. And the question, so one of the questions empirical linguistics or also psycholinguistics asks is which methods these could be, and depending on the types of questions that are to be researched. More specifically, what you can research, or what some of the questions psycholinguistics is concerned about are, for example, what this knowledge, what this language knowledge looks like with native speakers and language learners, so L2 learners in different settings, whether they are simultaneous or sequential bilinguals, whether they are acquiring this language in a natural setting, or whether they are taught in classroom settings. We can inquire what kind of current knowledge, so this knowledge is also highly dynamic, so it can change over time. So we can inquire which current state of knowledge a particular person or a particular population has with regard to vocabulary, sentence structure, pragmatic constraints, how these individual pieces of knowledge can join up together in a network. We can also inquire how this knowledge is put to use or put to work in real time. So we can inquire into real-time processing. And we could possibly distinguish progressive stages at which learning takes place, or benevolent and malevolent factors that influence learning. We can maybe construct an optimal or define an optimal learning environment, etc. This is the slide that I commonly show to my students when I have to teach methods of empirical linguistic research. And there are basically, so you differentiate between the two types of setups. So you can design either a longitudinal or a cross-sectional study. In a longitudinal design, you would follow a particular, so you would track a particular person or a small restricted circle of persons, a group of persons that over time, and see how they progress, how quickly or slowly they progress in their language development. In a cross-sectional design, you would target or a number, so quite a huge number of people at a particular point in time, and generate quantitative data that are ideally generalizable over a still bigger or still larger populations of a particular type. But with regard to the methods themselves, you differentiate between the so-called quantitative and qualitative methods. In quantitative methods, you're concerned with generating quantitative, so generating numbers. They can be online or offline data. They can be offline or online data. So online data, for example, reaction time measures, when you see how quickly or how slowly a particular person or a particular group of persons particular population sample reacts to a particular type of stimulus. Fixation probabilities are also an online a type or sort of an online data. There are also examples here of offline data, for example, accuracy judgments. So how right or wrong a person is in comprehending some linguistic input. This technique is very popular with children or with second language learners. Picture selection, acceptability judgments, sentence completions, or slips of the tongue. With regard to qualitative data, you're not so much interested in generating some numbers or huge quantities of something. Rather, you, for example, you interview someone and later transcribe this particular interview to look for some idiosyncrasies or some special use of some linguistic input or some linguistic data with a particular function. Or you can also observe someone's linguistic behavior, for example, in diary studies or with audio or video recordings or by way of elicited production, which was also commonly used with children, for example, when researchers attempt to trace children's language development, natural children's language development, and there is a whole corpus of child language data, which is collected by Brian McCooney, and which is called Childus. And there are also neurophysiological methods that allow you to locate language or language processing in the brain, for example, with neuroimaging, or to see the temporal, the temporal resolution of specific linguistic, specific phenomena processed in real time, linguistic phenomena processed in real time, as for example with evoked potentials. This is what I'm least concerned about. So methods is not something that you would use on a regular basis, but the techniques that are commonly employed are those quantitative or some of quantitative and qualitative methods, and we'll look into them in some greater detail, to look especially into quantitative methods, since this is what I more or less do, so what I do more or less, or the methods that I employ more or less regularly. And there are two types, so generally you distinguish between those two types of methods or two types of techniques. There are online techniques and offline techniques, and the difference between them is that offline data allows you to look at the end state, or allow you to look at the end state of language processing. For example, take, for example, acceptability judgments or picture selections. So you kind of observe the end product of some analysis that has been taking place for some 200, 300 milliseconds or so, and you observe the end state of it, so the final decision. And this would be the selection of a particular picture or the judgment of a sentence, the sentence rating as acceptable or unacceptable. Online data, by contrast, allow you to trace the analysis, so to trace the way a person arrives at this decision in real time by using, for example, reaction times or eye tracking. So why is it important? And this is also the slide that I commonly show to my students in our first, or in our introductory lectures into linguistic analysis. So, and what I'm saying them is that language has the two types of knowledge that is required, so that both of them are required to use, so for language use, or to learn how to use the language in real time. And this is not only explicit knowledge, or also sometimes called declarative knowledge, when you can easily access some verbal information that you committed to memory some time ago, for example. So if I ask you, when did Putin take office for the first time, you will easily answer, and this would be some sort of declarative knowledge. But the other type of knowledge, so which is also required, for example, in order to execute such actions as swimming or riding a bike, or actually quite primitive lacing your shoes, is the so-called implicit knowledge. Implicit knowledge is not declarative knowledge, so it's not something that you can easily commit to memory and can easily access after that in a verbal way. But this is something you cannot so easily explain verbally, but you can execute some routine if you're required to. As for example, learning a language requires not only some explicit knowledge, but also developing those implicit habits or routines. So on a par with swimming or riding a bike, when a book doesn't help. So if you read a book about how to ride a bike or how to learn to swim, this won't be very helpful. So you'll not learn how to swim in this way. And this sort of the same thing happens to language as well. Explicit judgments, such as, so offline data are commonly based on explicit judgments. And explicit judgments are, first of all, strategic and, or commonly assumed to be strategic and meta-linguistic responses. So they require some type of, participants have been shown to use strategies, to be using strategies to deliver, for example, judgments or sentence ratings or picture selections. So any type of explicit response. And they also require well-developed cognitive skills, such as attention or inhibitory skills. So there are basically, so if you just continue using offline techniques, there are a lot of factors that, or a lot of variables that you cannot control for, but that may confound your results and may not reveal the actual state of knowledge a particular learner or a particular person possesses with regard to their language competence. And one of the questions that has been inspiring researchers recently in this respect is whether implicit knowledge, so whether it's something that you can learn implicitly, for example, learning how to swim by practicing, can at a certain point transform into explicit knowledge, or can at a certain point shape explicit knowledge in terms of, for example, grammaticality judgments. And this is what a former colleague of mine in Braunschweig investigated by means of priming and prediction error in his, so feel free to research his, or to learn more about him and his research in the article by Jackson and Hobb 2020. And what he did was he investigated in how far priming and prediction error may inform or maybe a productive mechanism that might trigger language learning. So maybe a short recourse to what priming actually is. Priming is something like a repetition effect. For example, if a person or an experimental subject hears a transitive sentence, for example, one of the fans punched the referee, or the referee was punched by one of the fans, and he or she is then subsequently asked to describe the picture, then he or she will repeat the same structure that had just been presented by the experimenter. So if the experimenter described a picture in or an image in a passive construction, then the person, so the subject, the experimental subject, will be more likely to use a passive construction for their own description. The same holds true, for example, for prepositional and double object structures, such as a rock star sold some cocaine to an undercover agent, or a rock star sold an undercover agent some cocaine. And when the subject, the experimental subject, is asked to describe the picture that I have here on my right-hand side, then they would say, so upon hearing the prepositional structure, they would say something like, the grandfather is reading the book to a child, while upon hearing a double object structure, they would say something like, the grandfather read the child the book, or the baby the book. So the motivation or the origins of the priming effect are still unknown. Most people believe, or some people believe, that it is a result of learning, or it is also a mechanism of language development in children, for children's implicit learning. So children learn languages in this way. Or this may also be a mechanism of alignment in a conversation, in natural conversation, natural discourse, when the interlocutors are kind of try to align on this linguistic level. Or it may possibly also reflect poorly developed executive functions that we just cannot suppress so efficiently the input that we have just heard. Interestingly enough, the effect is more pronounced for less common structures, such as passive or double or prepositional object structures, compared to active or double object structures. And this has been termed the so-called inverse frequency effect. And inverse frequency effect implies that the priming effect would be greater for less frequent structures. And this brought some of the researchers to the idea of this prediction error, that the more frequently one is confronted with particularly a less frequent structure, the less pronounced this prediction error will be. So prediction error would be something like, when you learn a language, you make sort of some prediction commonly with regard to the structure that is already familiar to you, or that is very frequent in the input. And upon encountering some unknown input, prediction error takes place. So your prediction does not get confirmed. And that's how you learn a new structure. So in the course of time, you're trying to interiorize this new routine that hasn't been previously so prominent in your knowledge. And this is what they tried to, or they attempted to test with L2 learners, so the Jackson and 2020. So they asked themselves whether learning through prediction error might be an efficient way to learn a language. On the one hand, L2 learners indeed show the same magnitude of priming as L1 native speakers. However, the linguistic performance is less prediction-based. And therefore, learning through prediction error might be compromised and not as pronounced to the same extent as it is in children. And the research questions that they were interested in were can the magnitude of the priming effect be manipulated by the size of prediction error? Whether prediction error induced through short-term priming effects leads to long-term implicit learning, and whether implicit learning, so something that you learned by rote repetition and memorization, may transform into explicit knowledge. So whether, for example, the participants make less acceptability judgment errors. This is what they did. So they had 21 functional and monolingual L1 English speakers, and the total of 78 L1, L2 German English speakers. 33 German English speakers performed the experiment in German, and 32 performed the experiment in their second language in English. They saw a picture like this, as you can see on my right-hand side, and they were asked to create a sentence with those words. And what the researchers were particularly interested in was the so-called fronting of either the temporal phrase or the locative phrase, which is very common in German. So in German, it's very common to when speakers would be inclined to produce fronted adverbials in German versus fronted adverbials in English. Then they had this priming or training phase when the participants heard either a fronted or a non-fronted sentence. They had to judge whether the picture matches the sentence or whether it doesn't. And then they had to produce their own sentence. And there was a post-task to see whether the participants would, so the production of fronted adverbials increase with different participant samples. This is the way it worked. And what I found was that L2 learners were indeed more influenced by priming, so they showed greater priming effects than L1 speakers, which is good news. So they were affected by this priming manipulation. And the authors themselves explain that less experience with English appears to increase the surprising effect associated with encountering a low-frequency fronted adverbial. So why they were more prone to produce those fronted adverbials in English was that exactly. So they didn't have much experience. They didn't, since in English these structures are not very common, they didn't experience them much in English, and that's why it showed this prediction error. So the prediction error was at work during the priming phase because these constructions are not uncommon in German, so this cannot be a German-English transfer. But the post-task phase, where the scholars hoped that this would be that this effect would be a long-lasting effect and would somehow at a certain point transform into knowledge, into their knowledge of those structures, L1 English speakers produce significantly more fronted adverbials, but there was no difference actually with regard to L2 speakers when we compare the baseline, so the initial production or proportions of production, and something that they produced later on. So what we conclude from this is that L2 learners were sensitive to this priming manipulation, but they did not show any evidence of it, so it did not transform into long-term learning effects. And when the scholars looked, so I listened to the talk by Воркшоп with regard to the study. So when they looked at acceptability judgments with regard to those sentences, they were a nightmare. So this implicit effect was first extremely short-lived, and second, it didn't transform into explicit knowledge. So what we conclude from this study is that in order for our, for example, classroom instruction, we definitely cannot avoid teaching explicit, so we cannot avoid explicit instruction with rules and regularities and substitute it by, for example, rote memorization or rote repetition. Exactly. So now we will move on to eye movements. And eye movements are something by which also allows you to tap into implicit knowledge. Well, not native or non-native speakers possess of their language, and how this knowledge that they have is put to work in real time. Eye movements are not consciously controlled, so they allow to kind of, it's a roundabout way with regard to strategic responses or to avoid strategic responses. They reflect moment by moment, most native-like uninterrupted comprehension, language comprehension, and they might be sensitive to individual differences such as proficiency, cognitive capacity, processing speed, etc. that may come into play when speakers of languages try to put implicit knowledge to work. As I already mentioned yesterday, there are two paradigms to collect eye movement data. So on the one hand, is this called the so-called visual world paradigm, when participant sees or the participant is presented a particular image on the display. This can be a semi-realistic scene, as you can see on the leftmost side. It can be, these can be also just some sort of drawings, line drawings, and they can be words. The advantage of using words is that you can depict almost any, or you can test almost any word, not only those ones that are easily depicted with the help of images. However, this manipulation is also most sensitive to phonological constraints. The whole thing works like this. So the participants looks at the scene, and at the same time, some auditory stimulus is being presented. For example, the boy will eat the cake, as is the example from Altman and Kamide, 1999. And what they found was that the participants can locate the objects on the screen around 200 milliseconds after hearing the corresponding words. So our eye movements are actually extremely time-locked with the auditory stimulus, with the auditory input that we receive. With regard to this particular sentence, the boy will eat the cake, this happens even earlier, so the participants can direct their eye movements towards the cake when they can already predict that something that the boy will likely eat, or very much likely eat, is going to be the cake. Interestingly enough, there is so-called blank screen design, when the participants first see the visual scene and then are present together with some auditory stimulus. And then when the visual scene goes away, the participants still tend to refixate the regions that were previously occupied by relevant objects, which is an extremely inspiring finding, since it shows that language-mediated eye movements also go beyond visual co-presence of their respective objects. So the visual world paradigm is commonly used, for example, for studies of word recognition or pronoun resolution. And this is the study that I was trying to explain to you or walk you through yesterday. The study by the colleagues from Northwestern University, Marina and Spivi, 2003. And they looked at whether it's a common question that one asks with regard to the structure or the organization of the mental lexicon in a bilingual mind, as whether they have some sort of a shared lexicon or a common lexicon where the words or the lexemes, semantic information from both languages comes into, or whether they have two different pots with two different lexicon types for two different languages. And that's what they did. So we know that a particular word might have phonological or orthographic neighbors characterized by the extent of to which they overlap with the target. For example, plant might have planet, plank, bank, or plan as their neighbors, their orthographic neighbors. Or do might have dome, show, or o as their phonological neighbors. And they result by way of addition, substitution, or deletion. And so if one asks whether the lexicon, so if one assumes that the lexicon is shared between two languages, it might come to within language competition. So during processing or lexical access, it might come to within language competition. And this is the concurrent activation of lexical items that phonologically or orthographically overlap. But between languages, it may also come to between language activation, which is a co-activation of lexical items of a different language that bear some similarity, phonological or orthographic, to the items of the target language. And the items that are commonly tested in this respect are the so-called, interlingual, I think they are interlingual homonyms. For example, mosque in English bears high similarity to mosque in Russian, or Marke in English bears high similarity to German Marke that I have here, or Russian Marka. So Marina and Spivey tested university students with Russian as O1, and at the point when this experiment took place, they had spent around 7 years of residence in the United States. And in this experiment, the participants had to reach out to the object mentioned in the trial while their eye movements were being recorded. Normally, when you're using the visual world paradigm, you would have some object that is the intended target. You would have some competitor objects where you suggest that they are likely to be entertained by the participant as well at a certain point during the trial. And you would have a distractor object where you suggest that this would be completed or should be completely disregarded. In this particular trial, shark was the target, the intended target, and the scholars were interested to find out whether the participants would be entertaining either sharik or shovel with their eyes while reaching out for the target shark. And what they found was that they actually found this exact pattern. So when the within language competitor or the between language competitor were present on the display, they were entertained with their eyes. So they at around the distribution of eye movements towards, or eye movement probabilities towards the competitor were at around 18%. And when both the competitors were present, the participants were likely to entertain the between language competitor with around 13% of the proportions of looks, and the within language competitor, this would be shovel, with around 19% proportions, 19% of the proportions of looks. And this is a strong piece of evidence towards the assumption that bilingual mental lexicon is actually non-selective and you cannot easily switch off one of the languages. And even if the experiment is taking place only in one of the languages, but not in the other that you might probably be, you might probably be competent in. However, the pattern may be different for language learners. So this is actually an inspiring study to look into the proficiency of the experimental subjects. And for language learners with low levels of proficiency, you might be observing a different pattern of results where this between language activation would be highly dependent on the levels of proficiency. Another paradigm type that is also commonly used in eye tracking research is the so-called reading in eye tracking. And for reading in eye tracking, so reading is generally, it should be said that reading is generally a very complex skill that human beings are capable, some human beings are capable of. There are also, most human beings are capable of. There are also some human beings that do not learn how to read and write as part of their culture. But those of us who are skilled at reading, so they possess this complex skill when the eyes go from, actually perform different activities while moving or progressing through a sentence or a text. The most important type of eye movements is the so-called fixation, which is a stop when information intake actually takes place. And for skilled readers, it typically, so information intake, so an average fixation takes place for around 200 till 250 milliseconds. And important are number of fixations. So looking at a sentence or a text, important are the number of fixations and their length. It has been found that content words are fixated to a larger extent than function words. Shorter and more frequent words are often skipped or receive fewer and shorter fixations. And words that are highly predictable from highly constraining context, the context are often skipped or receive fewer and shorter fixations than words that are less constrained by the preceding context. There are also the so-called, that I don't have here. Anyhow, there are also the so-called saccades. So, and these are ballistic eye movements that take place when the eyes move from one fixation to the next one. And if we look at a language like English that goes from left to right, so the reading in English takes place from left to right, then our eyes do not simply progress smoothly from left to right, but actually at a certain point in time would also deform something that is called regressions, when the eyes have to go back or to backtrack and reread. And at the word level, it happens when, for example, a particular word appears to be especially difficult. And at a sentence level, it happens when there is some ungrammatical input, or when there are some sentences with an ambiguity, for example, or some especially complex sentences. Generally, there are more regressions. When the saccades are larger, and there are less regressions or fewer regressions when saccades are shorter and the number of fixations is greater. So there are different types of eye tracking measures or eye movement measures that you can look into, and they are subdivided into the so-called early and late measures. And early measures are that take place initially are, for example, first fixation duration or gaze duration, and these are assumed to be reflective of early processing during text comprehension, such as, for example, lexical access or early integration of information. And there are the so-called late measures that are obtained after a particular string of words or sentences or letters has been processed. And this is, for example, the total reading time, and they are assumed to be reflective of later processes of linguistic analysis, such as information analysis, discourse integration, or recovery from processing difficulties. And this is our study that we recently conducted with, again, L2 readers of English with L1 Russian, and that we presented during a recent symposium on cross-language affected bilinguals, or something like this, which was hosted by a High School of Economics in Moscow. And what we found earlier was that readers do not display the same reading patterns when they read in their native or in their foreign language. Actually, highly proficient L2 readers, so those who have comparable proficiency in their L2 and L1, they display shorter fixations and saccade durations. They have less pronounced saccade amplitudes and velocity during L2 compared to L1 reading. And we inquired whether the difference in eye movement patterns can also reveal which aspects of linguistic knowledge are captured by L2 proficiency diagnostics. Namely, all of our participants had to complete the so-called C-test, which is exactly, this is what a C-test is. So it allows to assess different types of linguistic knowledge at the micro and macro level, and requires master of grammar and vocabulary to complete the words. For example, here in the second sentence, it may be worth considering some small hints or whatever. And our participants were 21 Russian-speaking students with varying degree of English language proficiency, and they had to read 8 texts in English, distributed across 2 to 4 slides, and to answer comprehension questions. Here are some descriptives with regard to the texts that we used, and this is the way that our eye tracking setup looked like. So this is the way you conduct an eye tracking experiment, actually. And these are the results that came out. So you can see that the C-test scores ranged with our participants from around 20, so from 24%, or from 34% up to 98%, and that most of our participants exactly were around. So performed a kind of average on the C-test, and this is what I found out. So the reader scores on the C-test were significantly correlated with the number of fixations, their mean duration and saccade amplitude, but not with saccade velocity of gaze duration or total reading times. And the number of fixations, the mean duration and saccade amplitude are generally considered the so-called global measures of global eye movement measures that are not related either to early processes or to late processes, but generally to kind of global language processing. And this is actually a nice result, since it indicates that C-test scores indeed primarily relate to global eye tracking components, and that C-test therefore is an ecologically valid measure that reflects global language proficiency. If you want to find out more, this is still an ongoing project, so you can follow us on the newsfeed of Lobachevsky State University. And that was it from me. Thanks for bearing with me. Any questions?
There is a question on the tube, but
to methodology, if you want.
There is a question. It is not a question to you, in fact. It's a question to us. Hello, unfortunately, I joined the conference in the middle of it. Will there be a possibility to watch it full when it is ended? Yes, sure. It's on our YouTube channel, and you can watch it whenever you want. Yes, sure. Okay. Any other questions?
So you can ask any questions you like. So you can ask questions related to empirical methods, eye tracking, whatever. And you can generally ask in Russian. So I have a more or less sound command of Russian, I hope.
I can't say any questions. Maybe Nadezhda Nikolaevna? No? Very thorough and detailed analysis of a very special, a very new topic for us, you see. A new method of analysis which is connected with, I should say, psycholinguistics, and also to some extent with cognitive mechanisms, yes? Is there any connection?
Yes, true. Absolutely. So this is what you kind of, what you typically look into when you research bilingual populations. So in how far, because managing two languages in one mind requires generally very elaborated cognitive skills, such as, for example, inhibitory control, that you are able to suppress, or executive control, executive function, that you are able to suppress one of the languages while speaking the other. Exactly. But did I answer your question from yesterday? So how can this be useful? How can this type of fundamental research can be useful for applied purposes? So I actually, this is what I put into the talk. So what I inserted into the talk yesterday, the priming study by Holger Hopp. So this shows actually very prominently, or yes, this is like a good piece of evidence that something that was learned implicitly, so by rote memorization or by rote repetition, even if it has some short-lived effect, it will not necessarily transform into some long-term knowledge, or probably there should be some other requirements or some other type of some other factors that should be met for it to transform into explicit knowledge and into some long-term knowledge. And this is what actually speaks for explicit instruction ahead of implicit training.
Thank you.
May I pass on a comment?
Yes, sure.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so I'm the next speaker, by the way.
Yes.
In relation to Professor Hobbs' study, point one, how implicit knowledge become explicit, it's a big question, and it will always be a big question, though they should transfer into the explicit form. But following Julia's brilliant example with tying your sneakers, so explicitly explaining how you tie your sneakers is not the same as being able to do it or showing it. And that's valid for language as well. Point two, in generative approaches, and Hop is a generativist to second language acquisition, the acquisition path is the parser. Something in your brain should notice the difference with your native language. And then after it's spotted, even if it's new to your language, a new representation will be created. So the existence of this priming effect definitely shows that something has been noticed. It doesn't translate directly to explicit knowledge. Is totally normal because acquisition hasn't occurred yet. Noticing has. So that would be my take. It's nothing related to what Julia was reporting. It's more like how the professor himself reported his data. So I would say it just goes in line with general predictions of acquisition path. So that would be my comment.
Yes, you are absolutely right. So this is what I believe you read this article. So this is you're absolutely right. So this is what they are saying. I just skipped somehow. I skipped it because it's kind of difficult to. So if you don't have this don't possess this extensive background, it's kind of difficult to follow. But true. So the way they explain it is that a representation has not been. So even if noticing has taken place, it does not necessarily mean that a representation, an elaborated representation of this new structure has been created. And what they are trying to do now is that they are trying to determine possible cognitive conditions, so cognitive factors, and maybe possible environmental factors that are at play that actually allow to, so that might actually be in play to make this priming, or to come into play to make this into long-term priming, and to like for this knowledge to transform into explicit knowledge. So because what he was telling in his talk was that grammaticality judgments were a nightmare.
Any other questions? No more questions. Well, then I give the floor to Marina. Marina Sokolova. She will be taking the floor now. And yes, to code switch or not to code switch, that is the question today. Okay. There are some students who answered the questionnaire, right? That we sent.
Yeah, I will definitely say everything. Okay, you see the presentation full screen now, right? And okay, yeah, this is how it should work, because it's difficult sometimes. You sometimes need to see friendly faces, or at least that you're not offline, to know that you're not offline. Yeah, so, okay, I think I should be a very self-introductory person, which is fine. I like it in formal style. Point two, I'm the last speaker, and it's a workshop, and I made it very much non-technical and comfortable to follow. But I assumed a couple of times I will ask a quick question, a quick yes/no question, and you would unmute yourself and answer. But you don't have to. I will just make a pause. If nobody responds, then that's all right. I will prompt the answer because I really want you to feel comfortable. And yes, as your professor has mentioned, we posted a few like warm-up questions and you kindly answered, and I kind of know your opinions. So that's point one. Point two, this workshop is very much student-oriented, but it doesn't mean it is primitive. It means for us, it is impolite to speak over the presenter or to interrupt a big professor. Not the case. All questions are welcome. Professors' questions are welcome. Students should not wait. So it's your workshop. Of course, you may not want to interrupt and ask a question, that's all right. Use the chat or wait. But if you stop following, just unmute yourself and scream, "You lost me." So I will repeat. So, okay, get a little bit more relaxed than maybe a minute ago because Q&A and technicalities require attention. But yeah, so please follow. So yeah, my name is Marina Юрьевна Соколова for the Russian context, or Dr. Sokolova universally. So it was my privilege to teach at Nizhny Novgorod Linguistics University till 2013. It was like a little bit more than 10 years. And then because, as many of you know, even when you do a degree in literature, a good part of your working load, for me, actually, it was almost everything, is teaching English. And this is when I noticed that those of you guys who learn English, well, we are all native speakers of Russian, but those of you guys who learn English after either German or French show different acquisition path. And that's totally different from those who learn English right after Russian. How do I know this? Well, exactly. We take records of students' mistakes. We don't interrupt when you answer monologues, and then you as a professor end up with a good database. So this is how I noticed that errors that people make in English after learning French are not the same as what the learners of German as the first foreign language do in their English. So I decided I need to study this, started looking for scholarships because, well, currency rate is even worse now, but it was not that wonderful a few years back. So this is how I ended up in America and started receiving my second set of degrees. So I get a master's degree in second language studies from America and a PhD in psycholinguistics and mechanisms of language acquisition, second language acquisition from the UK, Indiana University in America and the University of Southampton in England. That's it. I will report at the end of the workshop. I will report very briefly some preliminary results of my pilot study that used self-paced reading methodology. That's only milliseconds and recorded answer choices, like because my participants read sentences pressing the key, the enter, the space key. So, and one word appeared on the screen at a time. So their milliseconds were recorded. And actually this approach means if you ask a nice linguistic question, if you use a favorable linguistic material, then you can get some knowledge about what is going on in the human mind. So that's basically the background. And then to switch or not to code switch, according to your answers, definitely to switch, because nobody thinks that code switching is bad or a sign of impairment, which was the case in the 70s. Well, not that I expected it, I just wanted to set the tone. So, speaking of the types of code switching, дай гитару поюзать, well, pardon my French, j'ai trouvé, j'ai gefunden diese, not j'ai, I. Sometimes I start a sentence in Spanish y termino en español. So these sentences, are all these sentences examples of code switching? So this is where I expected your answer. But if you're silent for a few seconds, I'll continue based on what we received in the questionnaire. Actually, we received nice responses. Number 2, French and German actually produced by a 2-year-old child is definitely a code switching. And it would be called an between sentence code switching, if you want a classification. Sometimes I start a sentence in Spanish y termino en español and finish it in Spanish as well, is definitely code switching intrasentential, so within a sentence. Some of you expressed doubt, very much interestingly expressed doubt about this. Дай гитару поюзать. This is an example from a lecture by Professor Gritsenko on stylistics. It was an example of subязык студентов Лингвистического университета. And immediately when you ask people, they would say, no, it's borrowing. Then if you start asking people, I mean linguists, then you start asking, okay, what's the difference between code switching and borrowing? And then the underlying mechanism would definitely be the same. Therefore, our starting point would be code switching is a way to put languages together where the grammar is involved. So поюзать uses use, the stem of an English verb, and inserts it. Actually, it will be called insertion. It inserts it into the grammar of the Russian sentence. English is very comfortable to be unmarked in this situation, and we use our verb marking, Russian verb marking. This is how we use it. And yes, it is also an example of code switching because two languages are used together and grammar is involved. So bilinguals. For example, a Russian-Armenian bilingual child speaks a very big language without even realizing that the rest of the world may not be doing it. And for example, he has two sets of grandparents, babushka and dedushka, tatik and papik. And it is very stupid to talk to this Armenian child like this. A child, today I talked to my babushka. Oh, which one? Babushka Oля? Yes. Who else? So, because the other one is tatik. And this very Armenian child would never speak Armenian to his Russian-speaking aunt, except for when he needs to say that tatik сегодня потеряла кошелек. Meaning she's not babushka, she is tatik because she is an Armenian babushka. This is what we know by observation, and luckily several decades of research has proven that there is no impairment there. It's the language or the linguistic competence of this particular child. It is developing, but if we want to subdivide between Russian and Armenian, two grammars are being acquired, and in a way that can be easily put, they can be easily put together. But again, lexical insertion is not such a sound example. Let's take another one, which is Spanish-German bilinguals, adults, and already an experimental setting. The italicized part is German. So the sentence means better in Russian, Хуан угрожал кому-то, но я не знаю, кому он угрожал. So the dative case is very much highlighted in Russian. Or we can use an ellipsis here and say Хуан угрожал кому-то, но я не знаю кому. In the acceptability judgment task, when you, a bilingual speaker, are presented with a set of sentences with code switching and you rate them. Most often like 1 being terrible, 5 being wonderful, 3 I don't know, 4 more or less fine, 2 it's called a Likert scale. It could be from 1 to 3, from 1 to 5 to 7 to 9. Well, sometimes people use scales like to 11 and 13. I'm not sure you get finer-grained analysis out of it. But adults who fluently speak, grew up speaking 2 languages, Spanish and German, like the dative, an asterisk means it's ungrammatical. So in the first sentence, the dative equivalent of German is selected. The one marked is disregarded. In the ellipses, all the way around. And the story is that in the full subordinate clause, the verb is present in German, and the verb assigns the dative case. In the second sentence, the verb is cut out, the subordinate one, and the Spanish verb assigns the accusative case. And dealing with 2 languages, in the sentence like, but I don't know кого, кому, 2 languages put together, and we are using Russian as language 3 here. Хуан угрожал кому-то, но угрожал кого-то, но я не знаю кого. Нет, кто? Хуан угрожал кто, но я не знаю кто. Meaning кому. So that's definitely something that, and again, if it's an experimental result, it means many people do the same. So there is a pattern, and there are rules that govern the way people put their 2 languages together. So bilingual competence. I was trying to prompt a conclusion that bilingualism, again, no need to repeat that it's not a sign of impairment. We're like 50 years after that stage of understanding, but it's a cognitive state. It's a state of mind, the result of which is code switching. It's based on a research, the previous study, and this guy, Lopez 2018, they're collaborators. So here I use competence very much in Chomsky's terms. Competence, performance, I language, and E language. Competence is something, abstract knowledge of language, or I language, your internal language, that ensure your successful use of this language. Performance or external language, E language. But kind of a misfortune. We actually deal with E language to figure out the state of I language, to be able to describe I language. So bilingual competence is something which allows code switching. Therefore, code switching is a surface manifestation of I language, of the mental grammar that a speaker has. So with this in mind, let's make a step towards second language acquisition. Second language acquisition is generally defined as a process when you begin from nothing later in life compared to your first language acquisition and end up with near native, not near native, very not near, very far from native competence in L2. Playing with these near native, I want to highlight that the reference point is monolingual performance, which makes sense. You need to know what has or has not been acquired. So yeah, of course, L2 doesn't begin from scratch because you cannot erase the knowledge of one language. You have a mental grammar that contains one language in your mind. With this, With this knowledge, you start working with your L2 and constantly dealing with good and bad influences, facilitative and non-facilitative influences from your L1, you manage to get to some good levels of L2 proficiency. Well, right. Currently, well, with this in mind, when you start from scratch and get to proficiency, it is very easy to trace the influences of L1 on your L2. And currently, research has taken another line, achieving some level of proficiency. There are signs that your L2 start influencing your L1. Okay, but it has been known for good 30 years that the bilingual is not two monolinguals in one. So there is something different in bilinguals. Let's say, for example, their linguistic competence shows itself in code switching. This aspect is absolutely absent in second language research, and I am starting a new project to actually bridge this gap. So what I'm going to propose in the project that is at the very beginning is to measure, to investigate, to trace the development of a bilingual competence, for example, ability to code switch in second language. So my approach would mean that we are gradually integrating the second language into our existing mental grammar, and we should become able to operate these two languages better and better. We have already commented on the example «Дай гитару поюзать», which is сабъязык студентов лингвистического университета, meaning high proficiency in L2. Let's take something like El Corte Inglés is a shopping center in Spain. So in the El Corte Inglés, 2 stops from where we live, is totally ungrammatical because we have the and el, both determiners. It was me who said it when I spoke zero Spanish. Very fast, like a month in Barcelona, and I stopped saying it and I started saying something like in the Corte Inglés, or alternatively in El Corte Inglés. Definitely 2 determiners became redundant and I only noticed it afterwards. So it's not a good idea to use your own examples, but I need to start from something. So my point here that something might be developing. El Corte Inglés, from being one proper name, labeling the building or the chain, has become a proper name consistent of a series of constituents, a sequence of constituents. That's right. That's a good sign. Okay, it's developing, it can be studied, but maybe it doesn't make much sense to ask me for grammaticality judgments in code switch sentences between Spanish and English. I cannot do that. So an alternative would be what I started with, to ask people to read sentences, ask questions, and do something unnoticed, measure something unnoticed to them, something that is not relevant. Here, I was going to ask some of you to unmute your mics and answer questions very quickly. It is supposed to be fun. Sentences will be as difficult as this, but if you don't do it, just do it in your head. Okay, so those 3 who I see have their mics muted. For example, I saw this woman yesterday in the park. Кто was in the park? Woman. Where was женщина in the park? Who saw the woman? Когда я видела женщину вчера? So we do it. Я видела эту женщину yesterday in the park. Again, who was in the park? Where was женщина? Who saw the woman? Когда я видела женщину? I definitely have a problem with gender identity here. Pardon. Another sentence. I saw this person вчера в парке. No problem to answer the question, right? But for some reason, I did it several times with myself, fast yesterday. The last sentence is in Russian, I answer in Russian. Question number 3 is in English. I answer it in English. When the last word, кто was in the park, I kind of, woman, yeah. Most likely following English, right? Right, okay, there is research showing this inhibition when you need to inhibit. Yeah, well, I mean, we are totally sane, right? We don't code switch just because we can. We code switch when it's appropriate. And well, of course, there is general understanding, and the answers to my preliminary questions definitely show it. Right, so the point here is that, for example, no one would seriously be reading in there or v, but all of us knows, we all know that the preposition and the article for English would be there. But if we measure milliseconds and we choose the right sentences, we can get some understanding of how our brain works with the two languages. Though today I will not report the milliseconds, but stay with us, as people would say. For example, to find a good linguistic target, we can turn to structural ambiguity. A sentence, "You cannot get a man with a gun," is a quote from a very famous musical. The problem is it is structurally ambiguous and can be understood as "you cannot get this man using a gun," or "you cannot get a man when the man has a gun." The problem is modification. In the first case, with the gun, the prepositional phrase modifies the verb. You cannot get the man, you cannot get with a gun. The second story, you cannot get a man, the man which has a gun. Fun, but if you try to say it in English in your head, it might not work. И вы не можете получить мужчину с пистолетом, при помощи пистолета. No way. No structural ambiguity. Therefore, interesting, but absolutely not valid for any research that I would like to do. Sorry, I now have to put it down. That I would like to do between Russian and English. But our good friends, very well studied ambiguous relative clauses will be extremely helpful. Bill called the mother of the woman that was talking about cosmetics. Иван позвал маму женщины, которая говорила о косметике. Who was talking about cosmetics? The mother or the woman? Okay. Bill, Иван позвал маму, маму какую? Женщины, маму какую, которая говорила о косметике. The mother. Иван позвал маму, маму какую? Женщины, женщины какой, которая говорила о косметике. The woman was talking about cosmetics. The same is totally true for English. However, the mother is preferred in languages like Russian, Spanish, Italian, French, and many others, German, Dutch. But the woman is preferred in English, Norwegian, Swedish, Romanian. Known like for 30 years, experiments, maybe even longer, experiments with monolingual speakers of these languages, eye tracking, decision tasks, all sorts of studies. So crucially important here that to get the answer, the mother, your brain needs to build this mental structural description of the sentence, where the relative clause that was talking modifies the entire DP, leaving the mother as the doer of the talker. Because the mother is higher in the tree than the woman, it is called high attachment. So every time you hear high attachment of the relative clause, it's option 1, the first noun that you encounter. For languages where the woman is preferred, this structure puts, your mental structure puts the relative clause that was talking right to the lower determiner phrase or noun and the woman is the doer of the act of talking. Well, that's convenient, but why? Among other theories, there is one, well, the one that I think is most feasible is called the implicit prosody hypothesis, which claims that there is a default prosodic structure in every language. And in low attachment languages, low attachment where the woman is preferred, the prosodic break occurs after the word mother. It's number 2 here. In high attachment languages, where the woman is preferred as an interpretation option, the prosodic break separates the relative clause as in an example 1. So, Bill called the mother of the woman prosodic break for Russian, German, French that was talking goes towards the first noun, like attached to the entire phrase. Bill called the mother of the woman. The phrase is split, the mother of the woman, this complex phrase, of the woman that was talking ensures preference for the second answer. Okay, what about non-native languages? That's actually my result. Here, all the results will be presented as high attachment, the mother as the reference category. So you read them as, so we only report the number of choices of the noun mother. Therefore, if the mother is selected 30% of the time in English, 30 out of 100 in general, it means the woman is preferred more often, right? By subtraction. So in Russian, the mother is selected 70% of the time. So we have L2 Russian, L2 English, and L3 English. In L2 Russian, those who speak English as their native language do it 50% of the time. If your L2 is English and your native language is Russian, it's 57. Kind of in the middle between the English-like preference for 30, the mother, and the Russian-like preference for 70. Okay, if English is your L3, that's actually, thank you, Nizhny Novgorod Linguistics University, people participated. Still, you do it in the middle in English. Armenian Russian English were the most interesting. They do it 71% in Russian, like native speakers of Russian, and 47%, very close or much closer than the others, well, to native speakers of English. Here we have a question and a problem. Most likely, it's proficiency. My participants were intermediate speakers of English. It's basically the borderline between A2 and B1. And they already showed something changing towards the target-like performance in their non-native language. Another option may be optionality has been acquired. Okay, in my native Russian, I have default prosodic structure. I follow it. I prefer the mother. In my L2 English, together with this language, I am acquiring its default prosody, and I prefer the woman as soon as it is acquired. Or maybe because I'm operating these two languages at the intermediate level of proficiency, I know that both are possible and there is no much difference. Okay, so possible research questions. If we put two languages together, what do people do? Will they rely on L1? Or will we see some universal principles, not specific to any of the languages that govern their processing? Or maybe there could be a cue that will universally influence meaning that will influence any language. And a prosodic break could be this cue. So what I did, and we are heading to the end, is created a quadruple, a set of 4 sentences with Bill called the mother of the woman, которая говорила о косметике во дворе. If you remember the implicit prosody hypothesis, a prosodic break before the relative clause ensures high attachment. Hypothetically, to code switch here will force a prosodic break in silent reading. Bill called the mother женщины, которая говорила о косметике во дворе. For the same very reason, the implicit prosody hypothesis, code switching at the place of the prosodic break should force low attachment. And to make it balanced, let's keep the bigger part of the sentence in Russian or the bigger part of the sentence in English. The last condition, as the title of the slide says, sentence start. Of course, we want it manipulated in controlled form. So sometimes we start the equal number of times we start in English. That very number of sentences, the same very number of sentences we start in Russian. So high attachment pause, this is how we are going to label it for now, will result with the mother selection. The low attachment pause will be the woman. Here the mother because it is Russian-like, and here the woman because it is English-like. So no milliseconds so far. It's just to keep it here for your self-reference. So I have very, very preliminary results with 8 to 10 people. Russian English, L2s, second language speakers, Dutch English, second language speakers, all adults. This line is significant from our statistical analysis. And here is the choice. What is marked in yellow is difference. So two conditions, the place of code switching pause and the length of the code switch elements behave differently. Without too much looking into it, it's noticeable that when the pause, the place of code switching prompts high attachment, the mother is selected 18% of the time. Low attachment, pause, the pause that prompts the woman results in 5% of answers, the mother. So there is definitely sensitivity. The same between Dutch and English. Please be reminded that both Russian and Dutch are high attachment languages. So with this 70% preference to the mother, none of the code switched sentences reach even 50% of choices. That is puzzling. What is more unexpected? English length. When the bigger part of the sentence is in English, the mother, high attachment, is preferred more often than when the bigger part is either Russian or Dutch. Again, the language that prompts high attachment results in low attachment. The language that prompts the low attachment results in the high attachment. A little bit of a closer look, the same story. Again, I color-coded to separate the conditions of the place of code switching equivalent to prosodic breaks and the entire sentence length. Here, it only reaches significance because this number is unexpected, but I wouldn't worry too much for now because I only had 8 participants. I need at least 20. So again, we start in Russian, we start in English, and the pause, the place of code switching break favors high attachment over low attachment. Again, I will take a closer look at what is going on in here. That's very good. So we don't care much. We don't need to see our native language all the time, really. Okay, whatever language. So with length, we see the same story. The length is in English. Non-native length, for some reason, results in more preferences for high attachment, which is counterintuitive for English. What I wanted to highlight here, it doesn't matter. If you start in Russian and it's Russian length, you mean it's Russian till the very last word of the sentence. But if it's English length, means you start in Russian and after the second word, it becomes English. So it doesn't matter what you start with. So your native language makes you comfortable to use the non-native preference. And well, English, as I have already said and repeated myself 100 million times, returns an unexpected pattern. Where to go with it? Of course, more participants, different experimental techniques, putting together. I hope like 5 years from now will be, I do it in collaboration with other people, we'll be able to explain what's going on, but it looks like universally low attachment is preferred. So the cognitive load of code switched sentences makes people go bit by bit. And if you remember the sentence, the tree for the low attachment, the mother of woman, the woman that was talking bit by bit. So that could be universally preferred, and actually it goes in line with the first psycholinguistic experiments from 30 years ago. So a place of a prosodic break is a universal processing queue. So you put two languages together, but if your relative clause is separated, you attach it higher. If your head nouns are split, then you prefer low attachment. Relative clause resolution depends on the language that supplies most of lexical items. We saw it, even though in the reverse pattern, but still, if it's in English, it's not my native language, I do this. If it's my native language, I do that. And it doesn't matter that we speak English, we are more comfortable in English, whatever, oh, sorry, Russian, whatever, Russian. We just follow something specific to the universal grammar of putting two languages together. So yeah, what I mentioned about collaboration, feel free to jump in and join if you have ideas. Basically, what is highlighted here is Russian English, Spanish English, and Spanish Russian. That's a study in progress. And I have high attachment and low attachment language. And I would like to have two high attachment languages put together that will definitely show that, for example, the same prosodic break, the place of code switching, is a universal processing queue. So I submitted a couple of grants, and I think it would be possible, might be possible, oh, how convenient, finally, the last slide, to do Norwegian English, which would be two low attachment languages. So Armenian, I have a setup, that's why it has number 2. Then number 3 is the grant that has been submitted. Number 4 is the grant that I am preparing. So it's basically a report of my current activities. And thank you very much for your attention. Feel free to ask questions, any sorts of questions. Well, not too personal. And feel free to code switch.
May I ask a question? Because
yeah,
I might be the.
Sorry, do you still need the PowerPoint, or I can stop sharing and we'll chat?
Whichever you prefer. If it's helpful, let's leave it. If it's not, then why do that?
Yeah, okay, I think.
Okay, so I may be the dumbest person, the person with the dumbest question.
Sorry, I lost you.
Here. So what is code switching? Because, you know, I have been taught that code switching is something that has to do with chunks of language and not with any grammatical features. So everything that is called grammar should be called interference. Is interference a particular case of code switching? And can code switching be considered code switching only if we're talking about two languages. So even if we're doing something explicitly on purpose, I mean, that's not a natural sentence that would occur in your daily life, but you are doing it on purpose, and that would not be interference, that would be still code switching. Not for testing purposes. Yeah,
thank you. Hopefully, and keep track on of what I'm saying. Hopefully, it will not take the entire lecture to answer. Let's begin from the end. Artificially created things can be code switching, but the crucial point would be grammar should be involved. For example, if we change every fourth word in the sentence from Russian into English, that is not going to be code switching. At least people with bilingual competence will reject it. It's bad, it's ungrammatical, it's impossible. So then, no, artificially created. And for that reason, I wouldn't go immediately for our acceptability judgment with L2 learners, bringing it back to my study. Let's do something silent, get data, describe what is going on, and then we might be able to define at what stage it might make sense, scholarly speaking, might make sense to start asking people like me, and apparently you, to give grammaticality judgments of code switched sentences. Then interference. Well, here I'm afraid I don't understand what grammar and interference is, because if you say there is one language and we insert something, we definitely interfere. Well, the basic meaning of the word interference, it is interference. If it is a scientific term, I just don't know what it means. Like we would say in Russian, интерференция из немецкого, meaning your sentence structure in English preserves your German word order. Well, yeah, but what's the point? And in code switching, why I quoted Lopez and his collaborators, actually there are only within up to 5 books written on code switching, like summaries of scholarly research, like bigger projects. So there are rules of grammar, and the first condition is none of the grammars is violated. And it's a little bit tricky, because I used the example when in linguistic condition, the accusative was appropriate between Spanish and German. And in a different condition, the dative. But actually, that's the point. There is something where the German grammar says, I'm ruling, and you must follow. And my understanding of grammar is what gives case, what assigns case to the noun. If it's a verb, then that example from Gonzalez, Vilbacho, and Ramos is definitely the example of features. So it's grammar in terms of an internal structure. It's not a chunk that is borrowed. It's something that is being assembled following the rules of grammar. So that would be my answer. Please ask for clarifications if I missed something.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. How do you think Chomsky became Chomsky? Through critique. If somebody has a question, I don't believe it, well, try to shape it into a question and throw it at me. I will write it down and investigate if I cannot answer. Nothing on the chat.
And I can't say anything in the YouTube chat either.
Well, that's actually not unexpected. I guess it's the very last event of the conference. I mean, everybody must be exhausted. And then us, into your ears one after another, like 3 workshops in a row could be tiring. Oh, well, then I think she just turned on, Tatiana Mikhailовna, hello. She just turned on the video to say hi.
Hello, hello. To say hello.
Yeah, exactly. Дорогие, пожалуйста, люди, которые здесь присутствуют, особенно студенты. Ирина Николаевна, Татьяна Михайловна рассылали ссылочки. Если кто-то вдруг в каникулы сможет, мы, может быть, я их даже попрошу повторно вас побеспокоить, не сочтите за спам. Только, пожалуйста, не делайте, у кого, если здесь присутствует, у кого первый испанский в иньязе. Как вы видели, у меня хитрая комбинация между русским, английским и испанским. Если у вас Major English, и вы учите испанский, пожалуйста, пожалуйста, чем быстрее я наберу там 20-30 человек, тем быстрее получу более-менее уже такие звучные результаты. Вот у кого первый испанский в иньязе, пожалуйста, пока не делайте. Можем.
Студентам заполнить анкету, да, я так понимаю, которую
там
вы
не анкета,
высылали,
там вот как раз этот self-paced reading experiment, и он на самом деле требует времени. Там, понимаете, какой момент? Там вначале нужно ответить на вопросы о себе, я это написала, но все равно имя может быть любое. Мне нужно только информацию об участниках, чтобы описать группу. И там ставьте пробелы, вот как Юлия показывала C-тест. Это тоже, как бы вы не убиваетесь, действуйте по первому импульсу, то есть не надо делать на A++, или как там у нас 5 с плюсом. Это опять же, чтобы у меня было общее представление о группе, чтобы ее описать. А дальше мне будут нужны ваши выбранные ответы и миллисекунды. Но на самом деле это, если вот вы не особо быстро читаете, как я, например, то это может до получаса времени занять. Кто читает быстро, за 20 минут делают, то есть 15-20. Тут, ну, как бы, я предупреждаю, о чем я прошу. И мне очень не нравится то, что сейчас происходит, потому что обычно я приезжаю сама тестировать людей, всегда даю шоколадку за потраченное время. А сейчас я ничего никому не даю. Но вот когда я так-таки въеду в Россию, я с удовольствием готова угостить кофе и поблагодарить всех, кто поучаствовал. Ну, наверняка же будут там конференции, семинары. И главное, не теряться.
Относится, наверное, к студентам, обучающимся у нас, да, я так понимаю, на программе Тимпияк с английским языком, ну и переводчики тоже могут подключиться.
Да, конечно. Да? Главное, вот у кого в иньязе первый испанский, только вот, пожалуйста, вам отдельно будет просьба, только ни у кого первый испанский, если здесь такие вообще есть.
Не могу сказать пока.
Ну, опять же, это такое общеадресное.
Ну, а
да,
у них уровень-то должен быть какой? Вот у меня такой вопрос.
Ну, в иньязе достаточно, совершенно точно.
Ну, а первый курс? Наверное,
первый
нет?
курс, они же поступили как-то. Да, в принципе, нет, без разницы, если там четко будет... Смотрите как, то есть C-тест, вот C-тест, который я даю, почему мне нужен C-тест? Потому что мне нужна сформированность грамматики английской как системы в голове человека. C-тест, он не проверяет как таковую грамматику, там нужно угадать каждое второе слово. То есть половина слова удалена, и его, выверяя с носителями языка, они тоже не делают 100%. И мне поэтому трудно ответить, какой уровень. То есть люди, которые у меня вот, в первых экспериментах, у меня было от 30 до 60%. То есть люди, которые заполнят этот C-тест 30, почему меньше 30 нельзя? Потому что там можно случайно угадать одно слово, повторяющееся, и у тебя выйдет 20% correct. То есть 30% это такой базовый уровень, когда мы еще сами не знаем, что мы что-то знаем об английском, а он у нас уже как-то сложился. И поэтому, если я только сейчас вам скажу слово «уровень», то вы все начнете думать иньязовскими мерками. Это 5, это 4, а это уже 2. Там даже ничего близко нет. То есть 50% заполнения того лингвистического задания, linguistic measure, которое там представлено, вот более чем достаточно. То есть когда вот я говорю, я первый блок экспериментов делала, всех, кто сделал больше 60%, хорошо, мальчишки-программисты, ну, аспирантуры, программисты, город Рыбинск, Ярославская область, они все сделали 85%. То есть вот я к чему, что у меня были очень-очень-очень обычные люди. Те, кто иньяз поучаствовали сейчас, там везде больше 90. У кого-то 87. Значит, то есть для первых экспериментов я их выбрасывала. Это сейчас мне уже нужно, ну, чтобы 2 языка были, жонглировать люди ими могли. То есть я выбрасывала, кто сделал выше 60. Ну, как выбрасывала, в отдельную группу для дополнительного анализа. То есть прям вот...
Я вам показывала же, а в итоге это просто получается диаграмма, где просто люди разгруппированы в различные группы. То есть там не показывают, что вот вы конкретно выполнили этот тест вот с таким-то и таким-то результатом.
Да-да-да, еще иногда бывает, люди спрашивают, скажите, мне любопытно, а я не могу. Потому что, ну, как раз по этическим соображениям я никогда не использую. И когда я делаю на бумаге, я просто присваиваю номер. Там будет ER, English, Russian, и дальше 1. И до 20. И я везде этот код проставляю, и вот такое. Но это на самом деле, я не думаю, что наши студенты не делают, потому что они боятся оценок. Я думаю, потому что перегружены. И я поэтому так как бы подкапываюсь потихонечку под это, что я попрошу, чтобы вам в качестве напоминания еще бы разослали, чтобы в каникулы, уже когда есть время, кто-то мог поучаствовать. Вот с этим связано. Я высказалась на обоих языках.
Перейдем на третий.
Ой, у меня нет третьего. Ну, конечно, там что-то начинает проклевываться испанский, но так прям
а заочному отделению это тоже вышлют? Ну, да, конечно, вышлют, если вы сейчас напишите свою почту.
Да.
Вы, те, кто в этом заинтересован, пожалуйста, напишите в чат почту.
О, да, заочно. Если у вас есть друзья, которые просто знают английский на каком-то уровне, не обязательно иньязовские, просто иньязовские это гарантия стопроцентного попадания.
Вы видите, да, вот они начинают
я
писать.
Копирую, я себе создаю документ Word.
Угу. Я еще дублирую тут у себя.
Так, у меня все зависло.
У меня, к счастью, нет, все хорошо.
Все хорошо, у меня тоже отвисло.
Ну, Настя Петрунина, не переживайте, я вам все пришлю.
Нет, знаете что, переживайте, в смысле, я сейчас открою чат и оттуда все скопирую, и еще пришлю сама. Но, опять же, через Ирину Николаевну, конечно, www.msokolopez.com, Соколопез, Z, К как Соколова. Это сайт мой, и там есть этот Contact Us. Вот представьте, если наши заграничные коллеги все это посмотрят, и как мы радостно перешли потом на русский. Ну, неважно, главное, презентация была на английском. Туда можно, только обязательно пишите там, я была на докладе тогда-то. И я сразу же отвечу, но я обычно все прочитываю, даже если спамят. До сих пор все приходило. Вот, я хотела сказать, что тем, кому Ирина Николаевна...
А что ты там не разместишь линк на исследование на сайте?
Потому что будет metadata.
Нам нужны...
Ну, в смысле, нет, там будет линк, но все испанцы сделают это на русском-английском. И я потеряю испанцев, которые очень precious.
Да. Надо точечно делать, потому что здесь, видите, какие лимитации, мне кажется.
Да, ну, плюс, естественно, это же мы с вами сделаем умозаключение о том, что мы знаем, насколько мы билингвы, а я верю очень даже сильно. Плюс потом нужно же будет найти этих русских иммигрантов, семьи русских иммигрантов в Испании. Ну, в смысле, у меня есть там некоторые направления мыслей и контакты, и посмотреть, что делают русские, испанские, что они делают с испанским, английским. Да, ну, испанский, английский найти в Чикаго, это, конечно, ерунда. Опять же, в Чикаго уже запустила я процесс билингвальные люди, испанский, английский, и испанский, которые учат испанский как второй. То есть у нас будет совершенно точно группа для сравнения между, ну, родной русский и испанский.
А вот предложение от Дмитрия Коршунова. Марина Юрьевна, a picture of you presenting a cup of coffee as a gift might work instead of a chocolate bar.
Знаете что? Ну, я знаю, что когда, даже есть, кстати, исследования, что типа когда людям, ну, за это платят, они с меньшей готовностью участвуют, даже там сдать кровь. Особенно у нас, то есть подходишь, поучаствуйте, пожалуйста. Ну да, вот шоколадку. Да что вы, да я не за шоколадку. А мне тоже хочется что-то сделать, потому что человек пришел, выделил полчаса как минимум, вложил душу, постарался сделать все правильно. Куда, хорошо, он, я так понимаю, в записи смотрит, в этом, в Ютьюбе. И куда мне это себя повесить с чашкой кофе? К каждому имейлу?
Ну, я тебе говорю, надо было тебе линк на сайте сделать, и там картиночку прикрепить.
Вот там можно. Ну, да, дело в том, что, ну вот даже в Голландии я когда начала делать, у меня же 3 было ссылки. Одна code switching, другая просто на английском, третья просто на голландском. Здесь проще, потому что у меня есть просто на русском и просто на английском. У people like us.
Ну вот, спасибо большое. А вопросы-то будут у нас?
Думаю, что обдумать и потом
можно
заинтересованным, да, e-mail. Куда?
Ну, на самом деле у меня и с имейлом все не так плохо. Вот. У меня и там Соколопис.
Какой интересный бленд.
Ну, потому что в Испании не меняют фамилию, а уж тем более не меняют фамилию, у кого заграничные паспорта, вообще ни под каким видом. А в России меняют. И потому, если у меня муж Лопес, то Соколопес, мне кажется, очень правильно.
Вот прекрасный бленд. Вот это code switching или не code switching? Вопрос.
У меня есть книжка по code switching, написанная Лопесом. Там, сейчас покажу, Суббери. Название ресторана в России, в городе Рыбинске. По случайности. Видно ли вам,
видим,
как это написано? Вот. Так что обложечка-то для серьезного лингвистического исследования comes from Russia. Народ у нас креативный, особенно в вопросах словотворчества. В этом, ну, как бы, we'll take the upper hand.
Если вопросов больше нет, мы плавно перешли на русский.
Совершенно в неформальную фазу.
Да. Я предлагаю закончить нашу Скребневскую конференцию. Сейчас я полагаю, что вчера тоже у нас был очень насыщенный день. У нас было пленарное заседание, вечером у нас была Юля, мы занимались с Мартином фонологией, и сегодня у нас тоже очень насыщенный день. У нас было 3 секции сегодня с утра с 10, и в 3 мы вот до 3 едва-едва уложились на нашей секции. Сейчас у нас было 3 просто прекрасных workshops, да, прекрасных 3 мастер-класса, которые показывают новые, совершенно абсолютно новые направления в лингвистическом анализе, на стыке разных дисциплин. Такие интердисциплинарные показывают нам молодые исследователи подходы. Где-то, может быть, первый такой более традиционный, как бы в нашем понимании, да, ну, потому что лексико-грамматические patterns, там, вот, кстати, code switching, лексико-грамматические различные структуры были проанализированы, частотность их употребления, там, скажем, в блогах и в интернет-сфере, на пакистанском английском и в сравнительно-сопоставительный анализ с американским английским. Здесь совершенно новые, абсолютно новые нам показывают молодые коллеги подходы в лингвистическом анализе. Я очень надеюсь, что это было полезно для студентов. Я уверена, что это очень было полезно. Для нас это просто invaluable, так скажем, experience. Thank you very much. Вот опять переходим на английский, но это для нас как бы нормально, да, это для нас обычная реалия, вот, что, ну да, как раз и демонстрирует вот, собственно, ту среду, в которой мы живем и уже много лет, и вот, которая царит у нас. Я благодарю всех участников конференции, благодарю всех, кто участвовал вчера, благодарю всех, кто присоединился к нам сегодня, благодарю всех, кто присоединится к нам вот с помощью трансляции в интернете. Я надеюсь, что это было для вас полезно, интересно, и это будет вызывать интерес к науке именно лингвистической. Имя Юрия Максимовича Скребнева сегодня звучало и вчера по-новому. Мы узнали о нем как о человеке много нового. Мы узнали о том, что можно взять из его книг, которые нам так хорошо известны, как Мартин вчера прекрасно проанализировал его книгу. Он остается с нами. Эта конференция продолжает традиции лингвистической школы, которая существует в Нижегородском государственном лингвистическом университете. До новых встреч. Ждем вас всех на конференции через 2 года, в 2022 году. Это будет юбилейная конференция, большая конференция юбилейная, посвященная 100-летию со дня рождения Юрия Максимовича. Ну и, конечно, ждем вас на других конференциях и других мероприятиях, которые подготовлены будут лингвистическим университетом. Спасибо всем за внимание. Спасибо. Удачи всем и здоровья.
Спасибо. Спасибо.